Some housekeeping before I get started. Unfortunately, the episode is late due to a family emergency that sent me off to Montana. While I was over there, I was a guest on an episode of Chapo Trap House, which I'm sure most of you are aware of, as I became insufferable on social media. On that note, welcome to everyone who's only recently joined the Bible Lore podcast family, which is, well, most of you. This is a chronological show, so if somehow this is your first episode, I recommend you hop back to the beginning and start from there. There's a lot of context you'll be missing if you jump in a quarter of the way through the story. Because so many people have joined, this show has become a bit more sustainable in the short term at least, so I want to extend a few massive thank yous, first to the gang over at Chapo, and especially Chris Wade, to all of my new listeners and supporters, and of course, to everyone who's been with the show since the beginning. The messages of support I've received have been genuinely overwhelming. I've tried to like and respond to every comment and message, but if I missed yours, please know that I probably read it and I appreciate it very much. All right, enough sanguine shit. We've got a lot of great history and mythology ahead of us, so let's get to it. Welcome back to the Bible Lore Podcast, Episode 33, The Messiah, Part 2. In mid-October 539 BCE, the 80-ish-year-old Nabonidus, last king of Babylon, found himself in Persian custody. His empire had fallen almost overnight, under the crushing weight of Cyrus's decades-long remaking of the Middle East. For even the most pro-Babylon members of the Judahite communities in Mesopotamia, the feeling must have been something like,
"Oh, God, geez, that's terrible."
What the hell is that, dude? That didn't sound very genuine.
No.
But what did it mean for them, and for the other foreign peoples living in Babylon? What do the exiled people hope for if they find out, against all odds, that they can return home? Do they even want to go home? That's where Cyrus comes in, as the conqueror sets up an administration that's kinda not terrible, actually. Okay, there's still plenty of conquest to come, and plenty of looting and forced tribute that comes with that, and, slavery's obviously still a thing, but, well, that's what we'll be talking about today. What happens next? Today, we'll be delving into the last years of Cyrus, the late exilic prophecies of works like Ezekiel and 2nd Isaiah, and finally, the return of the exiles from Babylon, featuring the world's biggest asterisk. Our sources for this episode are, once again, Waters' King of the World and Herodotus' Histories, and plenty from the good book itself. As always, these and all other sources are listed in the bibliography portion of the episode description. Thank you, as always, to my Patreon supporters for keeping this show ad-free. You can join their ranks for just $5 a month at patreon.com/BibleLorePodcast. Few battles seem to have taken place in Babylon in the wake of Cyrus's resounding defeat of Nabonidus' forces, leaving plenty of time for the Persian administration to begin setting up outposts and organizing the state. They just kind of showed up and did it, and it was mostly fine. Babylonian New Year was only a few months away, and Cyrus began preparations to take his rightful place as king in the rituals and festivities, with a coronation event to celebrate the return of Marduk to his place atop the Babylonian pantheon in style. Cyrus had undoubtedly grown up around tales of the glory of Babylon's Akitu festival since he was a young child. As I discussed in the last episode, it's possible his uncle was a royal hostage in the waning years of the Assyrian Empire, and as someone from an influential family just beyond the reach of the prestigious Mesopotamian empires, he would have been educated in their history and their customs, and now he was their ruler. The first Shah of a greater Persian state that was ruled by a variety of dynasties and which took a variety of forms until 1979, when the office was finally abolished. As someone who sought to win hearts and minds among the Mesopotamian peoples, Cyrus followed ancient tradition and had a formulaic inscription written in Akkadian celebrating the story of his rise to the throne of Babylon. This famous inscription, known as the Cyrus cylinder, was a typical sort of dedicatory time capsule placed under the foundation of monumental buildings, often featuring royal propaganda that celebrated renovations and coronations and other important occasions. The cylinder is shaped like an elongated barrel, and it's probably the artwork for this episode. We'll see. The Cyrus cylinder was placed beneath Exile, the central Babylonian temple that functioned broadly in the same way the house of Yahweh did in Mount Zion. It was Marduk's great home on earth that mirrored the cosmic Exile of the Enuma Elish. In late 539 or early 538 BCE, the conqueror added his name to the storied list of rulers who had commissioned such inscriptions at this most auspicious and important of god homes. There the cylinder sat as a foundation deposit, relatively undisturbed for over 2,300 years until, in 1879, a team of archaeologists led by Assyriologist Hormuz Rassam rediscovered it when they excavated Exile. Rassam was from Mosul in the north, but he nevertheless worked for the Ottomans on behalf of the British Empire, who took possession of the Cyrus cylinder upon its discovery. In 1971, the Iranian Pahlavi regime decided to mark the 2,500-year anniversary of the Persian Empire's founding, arguably missing the mark by a few years, but that's no matter. As part of this propaganda campaign, though, the Cyrus cylinder was displayed in Tehran, and a replica was gifted to the UN Secretary General, with the U.S. puppet Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, declaring the cylinder the first charter of human rights, ironically turning an ancient piece of royal propaganda into a modern one done by a notorious human rights abuser and imperial stooge. 4 years earlier, Pahlavi had declared himself Shah on Shah, King of Kings, a title that originated with the Achaemenid kings like Cyrus, but one that had not been used by Persian rulers for centuries. And all this despite Pahlavi not really being a particularly independent king of kings. The status of Cyrus, on the other hand, was not in dispute. Here's a bit from his famous cylinder, quote, "An incompetent person was installed to exercise lordship over his country." Now, all right, let me just cut in here. I think that's extremely rude, first of all, and Nabonidus was frankly a cool guy behind the scenes if you got to know him. He didn't have a lot of fans, but he brought all of them out to his cool desert oasis. He was good to his day ones. He didn't let the money change him. And frankly, I think it's beneath Cyrus to say shit like that. Anyway, the new king of Babylon, and so much more, continues on, talking about how incompetent and stupid my beloved Nabonidus was, slandering him, libeling him, saying that Nabonidus was basically enacting slavery through Corvée labor requirements for his grand building and renovation projects, which were obviously very neat and gave us a museum, so, lighten up, man. Cyrus also talks about how much Marduk really wanted him to be king of Babylon. Quote, "When I entered Babylon in a peaceful manner, I took up my lordly reign in the royal palace amidst rejoicing and happiness. Marduk, the great lord, established for me my destiny, the one whose vast heart loves Babylon, and I daily attended to his worship. My vast army moved about Babylon in peace. I did not permit anyone to frighten the people of Sumer and Akkad. I sought the welfare of the city of Babylon and all its sacred centers. As for the citizens of Babylon, upon whom he, that is, Nabonidus, imposed corvée, which was not the god's will and not befitting them, I relieved their weariness and freed them from their service. Marduk, the great lord, rejoiced over my good deeds. He sent gracious blessings upon me, Cyrus, the king who worshipped him, and upon Cambyses, the son who is my offspring, and upon all my army, and in peace before him we move about." By now, the general cadences of ancient Middle Eastern royal justification propaganda should be pretty familiar to all of you. The gods, or more specifically in this case just Marduk was mad at the former king for straying from his will, so he sent me in to make things right. Cyrus goes on to reference Ashurbanipal specifically as a model he saw himself replicating and honoring with his rule. This is especially ironic considering the brutal Ashurbanipal's massive building projects undoubtedly required as much corvée labor as Nabonidus's, but, whatever, that's fine. No matter, Ashurbanipal was exactly the kind of powerful and pious image Cyrus sought to construct for himself. The Nabonidus Chronicle, a quasi-satirical tale which recounts the dissatisfaction of Babylon with their final king, does indeed corroborate the Cyrus cylinder for the most part. It's here, not surprisingly, that we learn of a certain battle of Opis where many were slaughtered, something curiously not included in the foundation deposit, but it does paint a mostly similar portrait. Quote, "On the third day of the month Arasamna, Cyrus entered Babylon. The Haru vessels were filled before him. There was peace in the city while Cyrus spoke his greeting to Babylon in its entirety. Gubaru, his district officer, appointed the district officers in Babylon. From the month of Kislevu to the month Adaru, the gods of Akkad which Nabonidus had brought to Babylon returned to their places. On the night of the 11th of the month of Arasamna, Ugbaru, one of Cyrus's governors in the east, died." But the death of this important governor in late October 538 did not stop the partying, as the gods returned home from the siege conditions Mesopotamia had been under for most of the year in preparation for an extensive conflict that never came. The temples got their statues back, the gods were appeased at the resumption of their rituals of care, and just 6 months later, by March of 539, all of them had been returned, and life was back on track. No drawn-out sieges, little missed harvest, and the planting season, the Babylonian New Year, was just around the corner. This was going to be the emperor's big moment, the consolidation of his reign in one of the most prestigious and storied cities that the political landscape had to offer, a place with a millennium of history behind it. He was in the land of Hammurabi, by then a legendary king as distant from Cyrus as Charlemagne is from us. But the parade was about to get rained on. Around the same time that the announcement of the completion of the God Repatriation Project was promulgated, in mid-March of 539 BCE, a messenger arrived from the east, bearing terrible news to Babylon. Cyrus's favored wife was dead. Again from the Chronicle, quote, "In the month Adaru, the king's wife died. From the 27th of the month Adaru to the 3rd of the month Nisanu, there was an official mourning period in Akkad." Herodotus, for all we question and abuse the poor guy, does actually get this one right, and he even gives us a name for the queen. Quote, "Kasandani had died while Cyrus was still alive, and he not only bitterly lamented her loss, but issued a proclamation that all his subjects should go into mourning for her." Whether that truly was the queen's name is unknown, but if Herodotus got this event right, I'm more than willing to give the old fella the benefit of the doubt, so we'll call her Kasandani. The day after this state-ordained mourning period ended, the 4th of Nisan, as it's still known in the Jewish calendar, marked the beginning of the Lunar New Year, and spring, as the 12-month cycle that we have inherited from Babylon, began again. Cyrus wiped away the tears, the dust and ashes off his forehead, and oversaw the Akidu festival with all its ritual pomp and circumstance, affirming Marduk's rule over Babylon and his undisputed seat atop the pantheon. Sin, the moon god briefly ascended in a limited official political capacity under Nabonidus, was out. Cyrus, alongside his son and heir apparent Cambyses, attended the ceremony dressed in elaborate Elamite royal garb, a recognition of their eastern extraction that still carried the prestige of the ancient, fairly powerful, and occasionally independent kings of Elam. His recognition of local cultic customs and patronage of local gods with great care paid to detail was part of the charm offensive of the Persian conquest. Like other empires, tribute was going to be paid, but despite the massive increase in imperial authority and geographical range, the gods could keep most of their share, and they would be respected by the Shah and Shah. Still, there was to be no misunderstanding of what the overall relationship was. Cyrus was crowned king of Babylon in a traditional coronation ceremony, again alongside Cambyses. The Hebrew Bible, despite its regular condemnation of foreign kings and gods, agrees with this veneration and even expands on it. Cyrus becomes more than just the Persian king who happened to fix a rough situation for the Judahite exiles. It's just like I quoted in episode 32, he's God's anointed one. He's God's servant. And there's a good reason for this given in the book of Ezra, and somewhat corroborated by what I read from the famous cylinder. The king apparently let those who had been deported to Babylon go home. You heard that right. The exile is over. Kind of. Let's get into it. The book of Ezra, written a fair while after the events described, is especially emphatic about the matter of Cyrus's greatness and justice. Ezra and a related work, Nehemiah, are composed by different authors, but are combined in the Jewish Tanakh into one book. In fact, they're also combined in the Old Greek translation, the Septuagint. The tradition that they're a single work, frankly, goes back a long ways, though the differences in language have made modern scholars reject that assumption. Even Jerome, who produced what would become known as the Vulgate of the late 4th and early 5th century CE, recognized that they were separate works, and that's basically what all modern scholars hold to. At the beginning of Ezra, the author recounts a brief edict from Cyrus freeing the exiled Judahites. Quote, "In the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, as the word of Yahweh by Jeremiah had come to fulfillment, Yahweh roused the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia, and he sent forth a proclamation through all his kingdom, and in a writ as well, saying, Thus said Cyrus, king of Persia, all the kingdoms of the earth has Yahweh, God of Israel, given me, and he has ordered me to build him a house in Jerusalem, which is in Judah. And whoever among you of all his people, may his God be with him, let him go up to Jerusalem, which is in Judah, and build the house of Yahweh, God of Israel. He is the God who is in Jerusalem. And whoever remains in all the places where they sojourn, let the people of his place support him with silver and with gold and with goods and with beasts together with the freewill offerings for the house of the God who is in Jerusalem." And this is definitely not what the cylinder says. The cylinder, in the middle of discussing the gods being returned to their cities and all sorts of other things, makes a brief note about people being allowed to return home. That's it. The announcement in Ezra is relatively mundane, and Cyrus was definitely willing to honor local gods like Marduk or even Yahweh, but whether this edict was based on a real one is beyond our ability to recover. It's hard to imagine Cyrus caring that much about a group of Judahite elites, and, what's more, we don't really have much in the way of contemporary evidence to compare it with. This leads us into the weeds with an important question in our back pocket. What is the exile? Were most people even familiar with the exile as a concept? Past Bible lore guest scholar Andrew Tobolowsky has framed this in a fascinating way in an article published literally as I've been writing this episode, which is linked in the Bibliography. Andrew's main thrust is that for a lot of supposedly exiled Judahites, the exile, capital E, didn't happen. That's not to say that people weren't deported from Jerusalem under Nebuchadnezzar. The elites in particular obviously were. Many cities were destroyed. But that for those whose parents or grandparents had been deported, not all of them wanted to move back to Judah. It had been as much as 60 years or longer. And hey, life in Mesopotamia wasn't so bad. But that is not what we are told in the Hebrew Bible. And that's a big, big problem, because so much of modern scholarship has still framed everything around the capital E exile, and we can often forget that if Cyrus did indeed let everyone leave and return to their homelands, most of them didn't. The Temple of Jerusalem wasn't rebuilt immediately. It probably didn't even start for a decade or longer. In archaeology, there is no massive population increase in Jerusalem or anywhere else in Judah that has been found from this time period. It started to tick up a bit, sure, but it took the better part of a century to really start to get going. The scholar Bob Becking, hardly a radical, notes that we should not be surprised by this at all. Quote, "It should be kept in mind that the myth of the mass return is partially based on the myth of the empty land, or phrased otherwise, the idea that we all return from exile is connected to the idea that we all went into exile." Becking puts the number of early returnees at around 4,000 maximum, boosting the population of Jerusalem by maybe 30 or 40%. In Ezra, we get a lengthy description of everyone who returned and all that they brought with them, summarized near the end of chapter 2. Quote, "The whole assembly together was 42,360, besides their male and female servants, of whom there were 7,337, and they had 200 male and female singers. They had 736 horses, 245 mules, 435 camels, and 6,720 donkeys." Of course, by this point in the show, the hyperbole of numbers in ancient texts should come as no surprise to you, but Becking's point is an important one. Clearly, some of those deported did return, whether by permission of Cyrus or one of his successors, but the land was not empty during the deportation, and it was not refilled by those small number who returned. Tobolowsky is right. if we're smart enough to understand that the myth of the empty land is just that, a myth, if we're smart enough to recognize that the mass return is, by all available data, a myth, then we should be able to recognize that the texts we've received related to this period do not reflect the perspective of all those deported from Judah and their children and grandchildren. The views of those who never came back have been almost completely lost to us. There are a few sources that seem to be written closer to this period, though. As with most of the Bible, we can't be certain when they were written with much confidence beyond a general, this kind of looks like 7th or 6th or 5th or 4th century, and it talks about that period, so sure, probably somewhere in that century or so. When you flip open an Old Testament or a Jewish Tanakh, the table of contents will look nice and neatly organized. I prefer the Jewish ordering myself. Each new entry in the table will be a book with a name and a page number. But as we've seen in this show, the picture of the timeline of their composition is far more complex than that. These were often works that were combined or elaborated upon by later scribes using earlier sources. And all of that, the issues with dating and composition that we've mostly explored with the Torah especially, holds true for the books of the prophetic oracles, called the latter prophets in the Jewish tradition. When I discussed Isaiah, for example, 10 episodes or so ago, a probably real prophet who served in the court of Hezekiah about 150 years before our present moment, I mentioned that scholars, even the more conservative bloc, are in broad agreement that the text past chapter 39 of Isaiah was written by a different hand at a much later date. This is referred to as Deutero-Isaiah, Deutero being a Greek term meaning secondary. Hence Deuteronomy from the Septuagint title of the book, Deuteronomion, meaning second law, since even in ancient times, readers realized that in Deuteronomy, Moses was kind of repeating a lot of the events and laws that came before, and even changing many of them. So anyway, that's why it's called Deutero-Isaiah as well. Look, you learned something today.
Oh, look at you, you're tough shit now. All right, that's cool. All right, I'm going to take a shit.
The picture of the composition of Isaiah, and Deutero-Isaiah specifically, is rather complicated. The signs of multiple authorship are perhaps even more visible than in the Torah. Most of the first 39 chapters of Isaiah discuss matters relating to the end of the 8th century and the beginning of the 7th. Isaiah is described as a prophet in the court of Ahaz and his son Hezekiah, and the oracles recounted are mostly relevant to that pre-exilic time period. But his call to prophecy, where Yahweh shows him a vision of the heavens and his throne room, a sort of cosmic version of the Jerusalem temple, does not come at the beginning of the book. It's in chapter 6, and that's odd. That's out of place. Those are usually at the beginning of these prophetic texts. But it gets even weirder. After a variety of oracles that are all relatively similar in style, chapters 24 through 27 suddenly shift to what scholars call the Little Isaiah Apocalypse. Something we won't get into for at least another couple episodes because, well, apocalyptic literature like those chapters comes from after this time period. But then it's mostly back to normal early Isaiah stuff until, another semi-apocalyptic or eschatological couple of chapters in 34 and 35, where there's discussion of a new age and the bad guys are Edom, a kingdom in modern-day Jordan that's come in and out of our history and will continue to do so. And then we get chapters 36 through 39, where it shifts to what we discussed quite a few episodes back, a prose narrative about Hezekiah paying off the Assyrians that's rather similar to the account in 2 Kings 18 through 20. Then, suddenly, the author is discussing what sounds a lot like the Babylonian exile, and wouldn't you know it, Cyrus is explicitly named, as I mentioned at the end of the last episode. It's written from the perspective of someone living through the last days of Babylon, in other words, and it's written in a very different style and using different language from everything that came before it. And then at chapter 56, the last 11 chapters shift to oracles describing life in Jerusalem after the exile and concerns that would have mattered to the people who lived there and then, and that's also in a different style. Joseph Blenkinsopp's commentary on Deutero-Isaiah notes that some medieval Jewish commentators hinted at a recognition of multiple authorship, including the famous Abraham bin Ezra of the 11th and 12th centuries. But it wasn't until the late 1700s that Johann Duderlein first made the scholarly case for dividing the book into two parts, 1 through 39 and 40 to the end. At the end of the 20th century, a German scholar named Bernhard Dohm proposed further dividing Deutero-Isaiah into 40 through 45 and dubbing 56 to the end Trito-Isaiah. Wikipedia will tell you that Dohm pioneered the theory of multiple authorship, but that's clearly not the case. Anyway, Deutero-Isaiah as a concept mostly seems to hold its place in recent scholarship as its own identifiable book within the longer book, even if the larger picture is probably more complex than a simple three-part division. This historical context is important to understand because Isaiah, and especially what has been identified as Deutero-Isaiah, will become one of the most important books of the entire Bible, maybe the most important book after the Pentateuch. Not only do later interpreters produce more cosmological ideas of a Messiah from those middle pages especially, but Isaiah as a whole is cited in rabbinic literature more than any other book, and it's also quoted and referenced in the New Testament more than almost any other book, perhaps besides the Torah itself. There are a few components that we still have to incorporate to get anything resembling the full apocalyptic picture that resembles, at least vaguely, what we're familiar with, but this is where a lot of this stuff begins. Deutero-Isaiah fashions itself as a rallying cry for prophets to repeat to the people, an announcement to prepare to go home. And it references the liberatory aspects of the Exodus story, but it also modifies them and expands on them. Quote from Isaiah 43, "Do not recall the first things, and what came before, do not consider. I am about to do a new thing. Now it will spring forth, and you shall know it. I will make a way in the desert, paths in the wasteland." Unlike Moses and the Sea of Reeds crossing, where the waters parted, now Yahweh is going to make a path through the desert itself to lead the deportees back to Jerusalem. A lot of this is framed as if Cyrus's coming is just around the corner, even at the gates, an announcement that things are about to change, and the writer is telling us about what kind of city and land he believes Jerusalem should become, if everyone obeys Yahweh. While the Bible does not have a single consistent theme, as we've seen over the course of this show, one of the major themes is about setting up an idealized society when they arrive in Jerusalem. It's there in the Moses story already, and it explains why that particular story became so important to the exiles. Moses is the prophet par excellence, and he writes the Torah down. By this point, writing prophets are not merely folk heroes, but they've achieved, through their writings, a closeness to their God previously experienced only by the kings themselves. Where once they merely acted as the mouthpieces for the gods, their stature, at least in their own writings, had ascended to the mountains of the gods. I think it was only natural, of course. The guys who created books like Deutero-Isaiah had to have been elites or close with the elites. They were writing either during or shortly after a period of intense political and economic decline, but they were primarily specialists in cultic political matters, something that was much less useful in an era where, well, they had no temple, they had no kingdom. Some faction of them, if you'll remember, viewed the house of Yahweh on Mount Zion as the only legitimate place to worship their God, and Yahweh as the only God who should be worshipped in this house. And even for some who may not have held to that specific theology, the desire for a return to their country was understandable and overwhelming. Proto-Isaiah and Deutero-Isaiah are oddly rather disconnected books. Their concerns are not particularly similar except in the importance they place on Jerusalem as a city critical to Yahweh. But there are some specifically exilic and post-exilic concerns that come to the surface. The first one is that, in the absence of their own temple and with decades of exposure to local customs, the author strongly mocks the worship of physical gods. In Isaiah 44 especially, there is a lengthy invective that begins thus, quote, "Fashioners of idols, they are all mere wind, and their cherished things cannot avail, and their witnesses cannot see nor know, and hence they are shamed." The author goes on to describe the carpenters as basically morons who don't even realize what they're doing, collecting wood for the statues of their gods while using half of it to make a cooking fire. Quote, half of it he burns in fire, on half he eats meat, he roasts it, also warms himself, saying, Hurrah, I have warmed myself, seen the fire. And the rest he makes as a god, as his idol. He worships it and bows down, and prays to it, and says, Save me, for you are my God. They do not know, and they do not discern, for their eyes are plastered over from seeing, and their hearts from understanding. This polemic is intriguing, partly because we don't get a ton of insight into how pre-exilic Judahites worshipped in their temples, but what we do know seems fairly similar to other cultic practices. They built glorious furniture out of wood and metal for their god to sit on. They fed him food every day by burning sacrifices on the altar. They had rituals and incantations meant to manifest their god. And they may have even had a statue of him, or perhaps a stela with his name on it, and other texts inscribed. As you'll recall from a few episodes back, the Torah explicitly commands male Israelites to appear before Yahweh's face. So Deutero-Isaiah is definitely doing something a bit unique here. Some of our most fervent, explicit, and relatively dateable diatribes against what most English Bibles call graven images. This prohibition on physical images of gods will become one of the defining features of Judaism, and to a lesser extent Christianity, which will have many infamous debates over what counts as a graven image during its 2,000-year history. For the ancients, there was a clear understanding that the physical representations were both the gods and also not the gods, literally. And I like to imagine that there's a winking acknowledgement of the inherent contradiction in the words of the rituals that brought the idols to life. In one text describing the consecration of god statues in Mesopotamia, the author recounts an opening of the mouth rite performed where the deity would be ritually given life, and the carpenter's arms are symbolically cut off, at which point he makes an oath, quote, I did not make the statue. I swear I did not make it. Ninildu, who is Ea, the god of the carpenter, made it. The text goes on to credit several other gods whose expertise in various materials and smithing would allow them to usurp the credit for the statue's creation, and ownership of the statue would thus be passed into the divine realm, leaving the god in a space between the material and the divine worlds, something that is fairly intuitive for people to do. For an embarrassing personal version of dealing with this kind of contradiction, I realized at some point in my Christian life that there was realistically no way to avoid all idolatry. You are always working in the context of a material world. Something will always emerge to serve that exact same function from communication with the divine, whether it's the physical altar at the front of the church, or the dais, or the statue of the crucifix, an icon in the Eastern tradition, or even a physical Bible itself. As Pest guest scholar Dan McClellan talks about at length in his monograph Yahweh's Divine Images, A Cognitive Approach, this is an intuitive part of what we refer to as religion or cult in its relation to the divine. Something physically serves to bridge the gap between here and there, and typically the abstract concept of Jesus or God in your mind won't completely fill that need. We are superstitious creatures, after all, and we are humans. For some of the more pious Yahweh-only exiles, like Deutero-Isaiah, the foreign practices of Babylonian god statuary may have seemed even more absurd because the exiles by this point had no temple at all. It's possible and even likely that the author had never seen Yahweh's Jerusalem temple before its destruction, but based on the stories he heard, he found an opportunity for mockery of the recently conquered Babylonian captors of Judah and an area where distinction could be made between how he saw his God and how they saw theirs. Deutero-Isaiah is famous for containing some of the most heightened rhetoric emphasizing Yahweh's sovereignty and power. Quote from Isaiah 44, Thus said Yahweh, King of Israel, and its Redeemer, Yahweh of armies, Yahweh Sabaoth. I am the first and I am the last, and besides me there is no God. Who is like me? Let him call it out. Let him tell it and lay it out to me. Who has made known from of old the signs and what is to come has told. Do not be afraid and do not tremble. Have I not informed you and told? And you are my witnesses. Is there any God besides me? Is there any rock? None have I known. I won't harp on this too much because we discussed it multiple times in the show, dating back to episode 2, but this kind of rhetorical hyperbole was well within standard royal propaganda and even deity propaganda, dating back at least to the time of Akhenaten. It is, once again, my dad could beat up your dad theology. Your dad is a dead idol you made between meals. My dad is the one who made me, says the writer, reversing the image of creator and creation. Quote from Isaiah 44, "Recall these, O Jacob and Israel, for you are my servant. I fashioned you. You are my servant, Israel. Do not forget me. I've wiped away your crimes like a cloud, and like the sky's mist, your offenses." It's notable that Israel is called a servant here, because that is another significant and famous part of Deutero-Isaiah, what scholars have referred to as the servant songs, brief poems throughout Deutero-Isaiah that frame things around a character or characters who are called the servant of Yahweh, Eved Yahweh. The first of these songs comes in Isaiah 42, quote, "This is my servant whom I uphold, my chosen one in whom I delight. I have put my spirit upon him. He shall teach the true way to the peoples. He shall not cry out or shout aloud, or make his voice heard in the streets. He shall not break even a bruised reed, or snuff out even a dim wick. He shall bring forth the true way. He shall not grow dim or be bruised, till he has established the true way on earth, and the coastland shall await his teaching." Scholars have vacillated between either Cyrus or Israel as the servant in this passage. Both are referred to as Yahweh's servants in Deutero-Isaiah. For Cyrus's claim to be the top spot in this particular passage, the argument would be that he really didn't have to battle much to conquer Babylon. No reed was bent, no lantern wick was snuffed out. On the other hand, it's plausible that it's Israel as a concept that lies behind this particular mention of the servant, but a servant in the future. The future may look bright ahead, an idealistic time where only the best things can happen now that Persia has taken care of the Babylon problem, but recent history has not been forgotten. Later in that same chapter, 42, the author has Yahweh lament his servant's past misdeeds. Quote, "Who is as blind as my servant, as deaf as my messenger whom I send? Who is as blind as Meshullam, as deaf as the servant of Yahweh?" And this is one of the primary focuses of Deutero-Isaiah, an accounting for the destruction of Judah, yes, a brief recollection of their failures, yes, but especially a path forward, an encouragement from the God of the exiles that their sins are forgiven, that they've suffered enough, and it's time to go home. The way Deutero-Isaiah begins emphasizes this. Quote from Isaiah 40. "Comfort, O comfort my people, says your God. Speak to the heart of Jerusalem and call out to her. For her term of service is ended, her crime is expiated. For she has taken from Yahweh's hand double for all offenses. A voice calls out in the wilderness, clear a way for Yahweh's road. Level in the desert a highway for our God. Every valley shall be lifted high, and every mountain brought low. And the crooked shall be straight, and the ridges become a valley. And Yahweh's glory shall be revealed. And all flesh together see that Yahweh's mouth has spoken." There's this vision for a better world in which the poor are taken care of, widows aren't simply left to rot in the streets, and a lot of similar elements of royal propaganda that we have covered repeatedly on this show. The king is no longer the arbiter between the patron god and his or her people. Instead, it's God's servant who's filling that role, and that can be Cyrus, probably the prophets, or even Israel itself. As we head toward apocalypticism, there will be a variety of elements that accrete on top of this idea of a servant, an anointed one, specifically borrowing terms from the description of Cyrus. Because the return to Jerusalem does not, spoiler, usher in the perfect utopia predicted here, we will see these passages reinterpreted as a more direct earthly event in the future of later interpreters. The writer, as with all writers, reimagines real-world political happenings of his own time through a divine lens, and these predictions of the near future will not only cling to the idea of a utopian society, but an increasingly specific and constantly shifting series of predictions about how all of that will go down in the next generation's newest near future. A battle at Megiddo, a conquering divine leader who could be human or angelic, a new Davidic king, and even the resurrection of the very dead. For the first 500 years of this development, we have very little idea of how popular all of these concepts were. We obviously have books like Deutero-Isaiah, but as with all books written in hoary antiquity, they face the constant problem of near-complete illiteracy. The Sadducees, known in the Hebrew Bible as the Zadokites, the top priestly class in the temple, will be said by the author of Luke's Gospel to not even believe in the resurrection of the dead, though Josephus may disagree on that front. Luke's author is relevant here because as he has Jesus preparing to be arrested and executed, he quotes from Isaiah 53's suffering servant. So far, I focused mostly on the first half of Deutero-Isaiah, and because I didn't want to overwhelm you earlier when discussing the composition of the book, I omitted mentioning that Deutero-Isaiah itself shows clear distinction between its first half and its second half, because nothing is easy. Blenkinsopp's commentary points out the fact that this changes significantly the character of the servant. Whether this means that it was written by a different person or is simply an evolution in a book that is filled with ambiguity is unclear. To Blenkinsopp, though, the servant is primarily Cyrus earlier in Deutero-Isaiah, but shifts to a prophetic collective conceptualization of all Israel who takes up the mantle of bringing Yahweh's will to the world, and this character gets beaten down pretty quickly. This is the suffering servant who becomes famous and becomes an analog for Jesus. If there is somebody historical sitting behind this, I think it could be about the way the returnees feel that they are treated by those who never left Palestine in the first place, something that is going to be extremely relevant for the next few episodes. The returning exile whose words are preserved in books written during this period and whose shadow hangs heavily over the entire Bible. These were not popular people, and they did not like the people who had remained. As an example, this week, Popular X, formerly known as Twitter user John Hinckley, best known for other work, tweeted out the following, quote, "The Bible speaks against interracial marriage. Ezra 9:2, Ezra 9:12, Nehemiah 13:27. Hinckley's purpose in posting this was probably nefarious, considering how clearly unwell he is, but he is not completely incorrect about Ezra and Nehemiah. As we'll see in the following episodes, these books, which reflect propaganda from the returnee faction over the century after they moved to Jerusalem, are xenophobic and hostile toward the marrying of any outsiders for the post-exilic crowd, something that probably happened with significant frequency anyway, hence the polemics condemning the completely normal practice. But some of the elites of this particular scribal group really hated it, and perhaps that explains some of the hostility toward them on their return. They'd come to see the people who remained there as tainted and dirty and undeserving of the land that they wanted. It's possible, of course, that the returnees, whatever they amounted to, were themselves treated poorly by the remainers, and that the xenophobia was a response to it, or there could be some unknown source of genuine conflict that erupted between these groups. But whatever happened that caused these polemics to be written, they will continue to be influential in some of the worst theology that Judaism and Christianity have to offer down to our very day. They will continue to be used by bigots to authorize their existing loathing of anyone different. Thankfully, while Deutero-Isaiah may have a lot of heightened rhetoric about the author's God and how much better he is than everybody else, it's nowhere near as anti-foreigner or anti-Remainer as Ezra and Nehemiah. If this author was mistreated or knew tales of mistreatment, he did not manifest it in naming specific names the way the later authors did. Instead, he put it into a poetic abstraction in the third person, referring to the servant of Yahweh as so beaten and ugly that people wouldn't even look at him. And here's a lengthy quote. "Who could believe what we heard? And to whom was Yahweh's arm revealed? He sprung up like a shoot before him, and like a root from parched land. He had no features nor decent appearance. We saw nothing in his looks that we might desire. Despised and shunned by people, a man of sorrows and visited by illness, and like one from whom the gaze is averted, despised, and we reckoned him not. Indeed, he has borne our illness, and our sorrows he has carried, but we had reckoned him plagued, God-stricken and tormented. Yet he was wounded for our crimes, crushed for our transgressions. The chastisement that restored our well-being he bore, and through his bruising we were healed. All of us strayed like the sheep. Each turned to his own way, and Yahweh brought down upon him the crimes of all of us. Afflicted and tormented, he opened not his mouth, like a lamb led to the slaughter. And like an ewe, mute before her shearers, he opened not his mouth. This is the most striking imagery found in any of the servant songs, and its tale of rejection by his own people and punishment by his own God is evocative and affecting. A climax before the end of the book less than 2 chapters later. To me, focusing on figuring out who exactly the servant of Isaiah 52 is at this point misses the greater forest for a single tree. This is a thoroughly mid-first millennium portrait of reality, of someone struck down by his own God for something somebody else did wrong, a theme throughout the Hebrew Bible, Homer, and so much other ancient literature from this period. I can't be bothered to care much if Christians want to see Jesus in this, as clearly that is in line with what the author is trying to convey, except for the part where this is somehow morally or philosophically defensible in a theological sense. Where conservative and otherwise fundamentalist Christians go wrong with this latter servant song is in pushing poor translations based on the Old Greek or on Christian tradition. The version you heard me recite is significantly different from conservative renderings that have more Jesus-y imagery, like the stripes instead of bruising, and other weird translation choices that have pretty obvious motivations. Now, that on its own doesn't bother me too much. It's corny and annoying, but who cares? The most obnoxious conservative Christians, however, spread conspiracy theories that Jews aren't allowed to even read the suffering servant passage at synagogue, or that it's left out entirely from Nevi'im scrolls, which is very funny considering almost all of the translations I have of this passage come from Jews. Anyway, I think the reality of the servant song, as much as we construct it, is far more interesting than all of the speculation that surrounds it. And unfortunately, that misdirection of focus can also impact scholarship, something that will continue to plague us as we draw closer to our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, subject of some of the worst scholarship academia has to offer. Isaiah 52 through 53 is only the first step on a road to scholarly Gehenna. Now, if you'll indulge me, I'd like to provide my own commentary and opinions on this passage for a moment. In his fantastic commentary on Deutero-Isaiah for the Anchor Yale series, Blenkinsopp discusses an earlier monograph on the servant passages by scholar David Kleins, one of my absolute goats of Hebrew Bible scholarship, who passed shortly before the show began. Kleins complained, accurately, that an enormous amount of ink had been spilled on just the issue of trying to identify the servant of Isaiah 52 and 53 using historical critical methodology. Blenkinsopp goes on to note that our evidence is essentially nothing, and nearly all of the context for Deutero-Isaiah's social setting has been completely lost. We have nothing to go on. We have almost no contemporary records relating to the so-called exile. A couple mentions of some people in Babylon with Judahite names, including their exiled king Jehoiakim, who's most likely dead by this point, but that's it. A list of names and provisions, references to a Judahite town. We have presumably people writing and editing books during this period. Maybe much of Deutero-Isaiah was even composed then, but they don't really tell us much about themselves. So even if there was a specific referent for a prophet or a figure who inspired these words, somebody who's mistreated, they're almost certainly forever lost to us. And what's more, as Kleins argues, we don't know that this was intended as a Ramana clef, a work that acts as a cipher for real specific people, like the book Primary Colors riffed on Bill Clinton's election to president. And if it's the author himself who's being referenced here, saying he was mistreated, we have no way of knowing. Maybe he was treated like shit, but if so, he doesn't tell us. He puts it in the third person. He provides us with basically nothing usable in terms of biographical information about himself or the servant, even less than our other prophets, and his oracles are situated within a larger prophetic work that wasn't even his, and his works were, in all likelihood, edited after he wrote them. And like all of our other prophets so far, we have no material to compare it with. Unfortunately, there's really nothing else to be said about who the servant was, if anyone. On the other hand, I don't think it really matters. We can still get the overall gist. Deutero-Isaiah was a prophetic writer who foresaw a glorious return to Jerusalem and the establishment of a godly kingdom where all of the enemies of Yahweh would be torn apart, and I'm directly paraphrasing him, like wheat on a threshing floor. Maybe he believed that Yahweh was the only God, and he definitely believed that Yahweh was the only God worthy of being worshipped. He certainly emphasizes these points a lot, but so much of Hebrew Bible prophecy, and this book especially, has a vagueness to it, an ambiguity that may be part of the intended effect. It utilizes royal propagandistic and extremely hyperbolic language to spike the ball in the end zone, venerate Yahweh as victorious, and mock the defeated Babylonians and other enemies, perhaps playing on epithets used to describe gods like Marduk and kings like Nabonidus. Further muddying all of this obfuscating language is the loss of contemporary accounts to the calamity of the exile and the passage of time. And Deutero-Isaiah, Ezekiel, and the pre-exilic prophetic writings that came before them, whatever they started out as, will become fertile ground for an ever-changing new phenomenon of elaboration, interpretation, and indeed, further and often more literal predictions about the future. The entire genre of apocalyptic literature itself. Whatever hyperbolic point he was trying to make, people are going to take it seriously, sometimes literally, and they're going to build on top of it. The return from self-described exile was an astounding reversal of fortunes to these authors, and their celebration of the end of Babylonian rule has left a noticeable impression on 2,500 years of history. Here, though, we don't have a fully formed apocalypse, as Deutero-Isaiah ends not with some coming war that spells the end of all things, but instead with an exhortation to live in a morally righteous way, a reminder that Yahweh can and does kill his enemies, and a hope for good things to come in the future. Quote, "Why, none shall strike fear if it is not from me. Who would strike fear in you before you shall fail? Why, it is I who created the smith, who fans the charcoal fire, and makes the weapons for his deeds. But it is I who created the destroyer to wreak havoc. Any weapon fashioned against you shall fail. Any tongue that contends with you in court, you shall show wrong. This is the estate of Yahweh's servants, and their triumph through me, says Yahweh." The author is confident that if they live morally, they will be Yahweh's servants, like Cyrus, like the one who was beaten down, whoever he was. And he will crush their enemies, just like he did to Nabonidus and all of his servant Cyrus's other enemies. Deutero-Isaiah doubtless wrote in the way he did because he was familiar with the prophetic works that predated him, and I don't think it's a stretch to say that he recognized a little ambiguity could help keep his works relevant beyond his own years. Now, Deutero-Isaiah gets a lot of love in Christian and Jewish tradition, but some of our most vivid imagery about the return of the exiles comes from our old problematic pal, Ezekiel. Ezekiel continues throughout his book past his scorn for Israel as a whore he'd like to see murdered and mutilated through many other oracles, often prophecies against peoples he was angered at, Tyre on the Lebanese coast, countries that neighbored Israel like Edom, and eventually some faraway kingdom we're not even sure he was fully aware of. He calls the king of this land Gog, of the land of Gog. Ezekiel speaks harshly against all of these for a variety of real or imagined slights, but in the middle of much of this latter half of the book, he suddenly speaks of a grand return of Yahweh's virility to his people, an end to the catastrophe of the Babylonian conquest over the Judahites, put into an image of dry, ancient bones having flesh and skin return to them as they come back to life, and Yahweh's breath, his ruach, that gives us all life, is returned to them. I'm going to quote here at length. "The hand of Yahweh was upon me, and he took me out by the wind of Yahweh, and set me down in the valley, and it was filled with bones, and he made me pass by them all around. And look, they were very many on the surface of the valley, and look, they were very dry. And he said to me, Man, can these bones live? And I said, O Master, Yahweh, it is you who knows. And he said, Prophesy to these bones, and say to them, O dry bones, listen to the word of Yahweh. Thus said the Master, Yahweh, to the dry bones, I am about to bring breath into you, and you shall live. And I will lay sinews over you, and bring up flesh over you, and stretch over you skin. And I will put breath in you, and you shall live, and you shall know that I am Yahweh. And I prophesied as I was charged, and there was a sound as I prophesied, and look, a clatter, and the bones came together, one bone to another. And I saw, and look, upon them were sinews, and flesh came up, and skin stretched out over them from above, but there was no breath in them. Now that's the stuff. He goes on to let the breath of Yahweh come into them. The word for breath is ruach, which is also used here for spirit and often for wind of Yahweh. So when he says, he took me out by the wind of Yahweh, that is the same word as the wind of life, as the air you breathe, essentially. This ruach is often conveyed as a spirit. That's not really the case here. It is instead a sort of life essence. Your bones, your body, that is you. The only way you breathe, however, is through the will and the wind of the gods. Once that's gone, your bones, you're nothing. You go down to Sheol to live kind of a not great life. Anyway, this metaphor is fairly obvious. Ezekiel believes that his people are in for a new golden age. In his mind, the first ever real golden age. Since everyone, to Ezekiel, even in Moses' time, was a rotten piece of shit outside of a handful of decent folks like Daniel and Job, who seem to have already become full characters by this point. Anyway, this striking imagery will eventually become the basis for the idea of a literal resurrection of the dead, something that is clearly not intended by the metaphorical text, but also fairly intuitive as a more literal reading. As to whom he defines as Yahweh's people, and to support the fact that he's talking about the present and near future, not the distant future, Ezekiel immediately deploys one of the laziest metaphors in the entire Bible. To tell you who he's discussing when he's talking about these people who are being raised to life, he says that Judah and Israel are like two sticks, and so he ties two sticks together. Yahweh makes it one stick. That's the whole oracle, in the middle of Ezekiel 37. I guess they can't all be interesting, but God, there really is some absolute dog shit writing in Ezekiel. I am suffering for all of you reading this again. Now, the closest Ezekiel gets to being a little nostalgic for the past is in his prediction that there will be a return to the Davidic line, right after the stick metaphor, quote, "And my servant David shall be king over them, and they shall all have a single shepherd. And by my laws they shall go, and my statutes they shall keep and do them. And they shall dwell in the land that I gave to my servant Jacob, where your fathers dwelled, and they shall dwell in it, they and their children and their children's children forevermore. And my servant David shall be prince over them evermore." So Ezekiel, prone to these exaggerated tales of the past and present, also sees the future as the opposite of this, a time where Yahweh's law reigns supreme. There's a similarity to Deutero-Isaiah's conception of the future, even if the imagery is unique. But this, right after Ezekiel 37, this is right where we get into some of our more famous eschatology. He then spends 2 chapters talking about a certain Gog of Magog, which just means Gog of the land of Gog. Magog is listed as one of Noah's descendants in Genesis, which means geographically he's probably referring to Northwest Asia or parts of like Southern Europe. So it could be like anywhere from Ukraine to Western Turkey. It's a big area. It's kind of, again, ambiguous. Maybe he's referencing someone called Gugu or Gyges, king of the Lydians, them with Croesus and the coins and all that is in Western Turkey. But it's impossible to know that with any kind of certainty. He describes Gog as a king from a far northern land who comes down to attack the restored kingdom of Israel and who is soundly defeated by the forces of Yahweh. Then he describes it happening again in a slightly different version, which has been demarcated as chapter 39. Yahweh gives Ezekiel a vision of Gog of the land of Gog being led down by Yahweh himself to the mountains of northern Israel, where he gets his ass kicked by Yahweh again. Persia joins in, and so does northern Sudan and lots of other places, but Yahweh has become so all-encompassing that he destroys them all. In other words, Yahweh, like in Deutero-Isaiah, is becoming even more powerful despite the destruction of his temple. This God has become a rallying cry for his people, and in a time of desperation and then reversal of fortunes, he's envisioned as having answered their prayers and rewarded their loyalty during these dire straits. Ezekiel then goes on for 9 chapters about his vision of the restored temple, how it's going to be built, how cultic affairs and rituals are going to be properly carried out. All of this in excruciating and tedious detail, which doesn't really match the Torah, using terms interchangeably and vaguely and with high levels of ambiguity despite the tedium. He uses the same words for different measurements and perspectives, rendering the entire thing a shifting sand to try to stand any interpretation on. Of course, we're already familiar with quasi-real, quasi-divine temples. Again, I mentioned earlier, Enuma Elish does a similar thing for the founding of Marduk's temple, Exile, in the heart of Babylon, though without such specificity for its construction and management. Ezekiel can be evocative and definitely provocative, but it's no surprise that several commentators I read while researching this show have mentioned his command of language is not great, despite the highly visionary descriptions of a quasi-divine, quasi-real future for his idea of Israel. His work has not stood the test of time because it's great literature, but rather because its topics of choice and methods of communicating them have allowed it to be interpreted in 1,000 different ways. Ezekiel's use of hyperbole in describing the temple and the revitalization of Jerusalem stretches past prophetic utopianism into near divinity, something bordering on eschatological. The heavens, the place of the gods, come to earth, following a fairly detailed failed invasion by Gog. This ushers in a return of the Garden of Eden itself, the Garden of Yahweh. His oracles also are the source for the great battle that ushers in a new era of Yahwistic supremacy, this battle against Gog, a motif that will become central to apocalypticism in later Jewish, Christian, and Muslim theological constructions through Gog and Magog. This king who commands the final resistance to Yahweh's supremacy becomes 2 people. Again, Gog and Magog, where it was Gog of... So it's Gog and the land of Gog. They're 2 different characters. Anyway, Gog and Magog are present in Revelation and Christian apocalyptic writings. And then we've got YHWH and MAJUJ in Islamic tradition. We'll get to the Islamic side of things in about 10 years when I finally get there. But there's a Religion for Breakfast video linked in the description that discusses the later traditions and is quite good. The thing is, Ezekiel's predictions about the future were mostly wrong, as I mentioned before. None of this happened. Tyre wasn't razed to the ground. Neither was Egypt. And the rebuilding of the temple is not going to be as splendorous as what he predicts. As with Isaiah, the ambiguity and the fact that the events described never happened are part of the tale of their enduring relevance. The reality of the return to Jerusalem was never going to match the heightened expectations of these prophets. Cyrus was meant to be the savior of the Judahites, entering their new province of Yehud Medinta. And he was. I think that's pretty clear from the superlatives of Deutero-Isaiah and Ezra. But he was also just a really talented king. He wasn't interested in forcing anyone to go back to Jerusalem, and it's clear that not everyone did. Judahite towns and neighborhoods in Iraq will eventually become Judean towns and then Jewish towns. These folks were in Mesopotamia for thousands of years beyond the so-called exile. Most of them didn't want to move back. But within a generation of Cyrus's divine-seeming rule, this really talented man's royal successors will face the cold, hard reality of imperial politics as a succession crisis happens just 1 generation later. This won't stop the Persians, really. The empire will be relatively stabilized at its enormous size, but it will still be a messy empire, prone to revolts and failed conquest and overreach and brutalizing its enemies and all of the stuff of empire. And despite this stability, Jerusalem won't become the center of the world, and Yahweh won't return to usher in his utopia. If this was our first case of apocalypticism, then it was a failure. to the point where a later book will openly satirize one of Persia's most remarkable and famous kings, Xerxes, portraying him as a stumbling buffoon. While we may start off with the Messiah and the Anointed One, whose reign is blessed by Yahweh and whose line is going to last in eternity, what we get in reality is, well, just that, reality. The point I'm harping on is, again, that this is why books like Ezekiel and Isaiah will be reinterpreted and stay relevant. They set vague but real expectations that can never be met in the material world, ephemeral hopes for something so perfect only God could be responsible, and that is an expectation that cannot be fulfilled by human politics. Utopias cannot be won without blood that spoils the mood, and Jerusalem in the centuries following 538 BCE was certainly no utopia. It's going to be fine, there's relative peace, but it doesn't result in an immediate ascension to relevance for the small Palestinian province. The returnees, whoever they were, probably trickled in small waves over the course of years and decades. Maybe there were a few large-scale relocations. Nothing ever fits a perfectly neat pattern in human migration. But it wasn't some overwhelming return that could match Ezekiel's or Isaiah's expectations of the mythology of the conquest of Joshua after the Exodus narrative. There was no welcome parade. The Hebrew Bible, as we'll see, paints a picture of them being sent back with riches, but the temple won't immediately be rebuilt. It will take decades too, maybe half a century or more. And it's not going to be Ezekiel's enormous Exile, not at first. It's going to be a relatively humble temple for an insignificant vassal. It will take 400 years and several imperial turnovers to turn the temple into a truly splendorous site, one that is still commemorated today. And the people who build it, the Herodians, will immediately be viewed as a corrupt and murderous regime of incompetent schemers with foreign ties. Nothing will ever match the visions of Ezekiel or Isaiah, and so we get these symbolic or apocalyptic views of these impossible dreams, and even a savior figure who becomes the image of perfection. Not just Yahweh's servant, Yahweh's anointed servant, who's going to fix all of this. Cyrus was never the Cyrus of the Bible, as we'll see next episode, because, well, we're doing part 3, gang. But because of the nearly seamless way he toppled what seemed the world's most formidable empire at the time, he became Deutero-Isaiah's highly exalted servant of Yahweh himself, his Mashiach, one who could bathe the countryside in blood, but was also so overwhelming, like the prophet's vision of Yahweh, that some cities would be taken with barely a fight. This servant of Yahweh status put him in the somewhat divinized ranks of other biblical kings like Nebuchadnezzar and David, cruel though they are both portrayed. A small number of influential Judahites in Babylon agreed highly with this characterization of Cyrus as they made their way back to Jerusalem, and relative disappointment. Since this time, Messianic figures have followed the example of Cyrus in more or less explicit ways. Jesus of Nazareth is predicted to come back by some Christians following Revelation in a bloodbath like the conquest of Magog and its king Gog, an avenging commander in an angelic or even plainly divine body. More crude have been a few figures compared to Cyrus the Great in the popular modern imagination. Some evangelicals, for example, justified their support for Reagan, who was a Hollywood sicko, with reference to Cyrus. David is also popular in these reconstructions, the imperfect man who still fights for us cliché, the outsider who's on our side. Most recently, Donald Trump has been called Cyrus the Great by the American Christian Zionist organization Friends of Zion, who plastered billboards reading how Cyrus the Great is here with a picture of Trump in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv in 2025 after Donald Trump negotiated a ceasefire to an Iran-Israel war. The hyperbole present in Isaiah and Ezekiel mirrors this kind of propaganda in their predictions about the near future. As we discussed in a recent episode of Superstructure on the 1970s Rapture bestseller, The Late Great Planet Earth, prophetic literature is always about the present moment, and the hedging that's done when its high rhetorical predictions fail is always a reinterpretation and taming of these specific events, and, more emphasized, a need to forget the interpretation and predictions that just came before and that failed. We don't know if Ezekiel was working from a known genre of text with such heightened imagery. He's fairly unique, or at least he seems so, but it's possible that the concept had existed beforehand. We also don't know how truly he believed what he wrote, or whether he had a significant following. We only know that he wrote during a time of great political drama. The tumultuous last 2 centuries of history had been a source for trauma and intrigue and legend, especially the period he lived in. While Isaiah, at least to me, seems very aware of some group of returnees and is obviously aware of Cyrus, Ezekiel betrays no such confidence. We have no idea if he survived to the end of the exile. Some key elements in this initial group essentially formed a cult that cast this time period as a kind of transitional golden age. And while Cyrus is about to die, we will continue to talk about the impact of his messianic figure as it transforms and births new versions of itself that often barely look related. There will be scripture written, Ezra and Nehemiah, about this period, and those writings, which blend history and mythology in uniquely Persian-era ways, will form parallels to the Torah and the Deuteronomistic history that likely mean these were meant to be read as companion pieces at least. Redaction of these proto-biblical works will continue on deep beyond this point. Scholars suspect that many of these books exist in some form at this time, but there are many yet to be written, and some that will be written and then fall out of favor completely. And of course, we have to talk about Zoroastrianism. It sits right on the horizon. In other words, welcome to the Persian era. From here on out, the so-called apocalyptic returnee concepts will undergo fairly regular metamorphoses down to our present day, a sort of continual brundlefly of men and women, both real and imagined, who become new Cyruses, who are themselves new Davids or new Judah Maccabees or new Jesuses or new Moseses, reinterpretations of reinterpretations that get applied to hundreds, thousands of figures. Cyrus is one of the first big ones. And the empire that he and his successors create became a relatively stable administration, one that will only be rivaled and then surpassed by the new Babylon, Rome. Before we get to that remarkable expansionism, though, we gotta kill Cyrus. Unfortunately, the death of cuneiform administrative records is already underway, and we do not have as much insight as we'd like to into Persian literature, which is a real shame. We're going to have to rely on Herodotus and the Bible and the Apocrypha continually, along with sparse Achaemenid records, and that is going to be a fraught endeavor. So goodbye, Nabonidus, once again. Your whereabouts, we don't know where it's going to be because of parchment Aramaic supremacy with all its rotting organic matter. We're really going to miss that clay when it's gone. Thank you to everyone who supports this show at patreon.com/BibleLorePodcast. You'll continue getting episodes 2 weeks early as my primary model of support and benefit for you. More Bible at the Movies are coming. More interviews with scholars are coming. We're not to fully sustainable quit my job mode yet, and we probably won't be there for a while because American healthcare is expensive as shit, but I'm hoping to do a first merch drop in the near future for everyone to be able to sport Bible Lore podcast gear. Thanks again for listening and sticking with me through this whole thing. I will see you next time on the Bible Lore Podcast.